Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started a couple minutes late because of Zoom difficulties, but here we are. So thank you everyone for being here tonight, and thank you anyone online reviewing this in the future. This is our first inklings of the fall 2023 season, I guess. This is The Phantom Tollbooth by Norman Juster. This is a book that I read or had read to me by my dad when I was a young child. I think most people, that's probably their first exposure to it, is when they're relatively young. This is a book directly aimed at children. It is a children's book. We've done some children's books at Inklings before, but again, we are always trying to pull out the universal applications, and especially for this group, the Christian lines of thought and how this can be useful. So obviously, this does have application for Christian youth. The idea that any book with a good moral message, of course, will build into the kind of Christian instruction you're trying to give your own children and grandchildren. But in this sense, it also builds into the broader idea of what it means to be a person with critical thinking, and especially with goals in your life and things that you hope to accomplish. The message of this book, I think, is one that should resonate really with all of us. So let's get into it just a little bit. So looking at the Phantom Tollbooth again, what is the message? The message of the book, and we'll really play with this a little bit later on, is the importance of knowledge and of applying knowledge in your own life. The enemy in the Phantom Tollbooth is always wasted time and apathy. The idea that you have the capacity to do something great with yourself, but you don't. So our hero is a young boy who, at the beginning of the novel is really unengaged, is not performing well in school, in life, but by the end is really not so much that same person and has grown. So obviously this is something that we'd hope for all children, and we'll get into how that process looks and why we might have different opinions about that in just a few minutes. But again, we should want that for every child, that you come home from school and you're excited and you're happy and you're engaged and you're not, I'm bored, I'm tired, nothing interests me. That's the path to nowhere. So again, apathy and wasted youth, wasted time, really not what we want for young people at all. So what is the Christian application? We'll tease this now, we'll get into it a lot later on. The idea that critical thinking and value itself is really things that are not that you need to be a Christian to understand those, but that for us it is necessary to understand those. You can't be a Christian without critical thinking. You can't just learn this by repeating something that is told to you. You might say the right words, but that's not what faith is. You have to understand critical thinking is necessary. Again, having passion, having interest, having skills, those all play into the kind of person you want to be. And again, that is really part of the Christian idea. There is someone I want to be like for us as Christ, and I need to achieve that goal. So again, achieving your goals is definitely part of what we're going to be looking at tonight as well. So let's start with a little example here to start with. If you think of the idea of what is entailed by a Renaissance man, someone who is kind of honestly good at everything, someone who is conversational, who is highly skilled, who can do all kinds of things, the person who you really want to talk to at a dinner party, or that one relative that always has something to say. What does that person look like to you? Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever felt like, wow, I'm really good at this one thing, I could get paid to do this, it's fantastic. I guess epitome of this concept would be Leonardo da Vinci, the individual in the Renaissance who, again, really started the phrase, the Renaissance man, someone who was skilled at art, math, science, painting, sculpting, all kinds of different things. Now, do all of us have the capacity to achieve like that? Do all of us have the capacity to be an individual like this? Or is this something where you say, well, this is a person who's been blessed by their culture, their exact situation, their parents, whatever wealth they had, and genetics, honestly, to give us this, once in a lifetime polymath. So we say maybe yes to the extent of these famous individuals, but I think what we're going to look at tonight is the fact that a little bit of that exists in all of us. All of us are, especially when we're young, and especially for young children, nothing but potential and nothing but possibilities. And when you entertain and engage those possibilities, you end up somewhere much different than if you shut them out. So again, that ideal individual, that person who can have all these strengths, is really part of everyone. You can really choose to mature in whatever way you want to. Let's get into the book here just a little bit. I have a special copy given to me by my dad. It is not this big of a book if you're just looking to read it. This has a large forward, a large afterward, and then marginal notes all the way through. This book is also illustrated, and so it kind of gives you a false sense of how thick it actually is. I would say maybe a couple hours to read all the way through it. So again, not to be intimidated by the large hardbound copy that I have here, but definitely something that is, again, not too tough of a read. Again, a book for children. Originally published in 1961, this book has made a large impact and a very, very well-selling book and a good piece of literature all around. But at the very beginning of its published life, not so much. It was really slow to pick up. Nobody really cared much about it. This was being published at about the same time as a lot of other big, especially historical fiction epics, I think were big that year. And so it was really overshadowed between a lot of other works. And it was really saved by a positive review in the New Yorker. I think the editor's wife, I don't know if I have her name here. I think I'll post that later in a different slide. But the editor's wife published a very positive review and compared it to the book Pilgrim's Progress, which again Clay did for us for Inklings last year, I believe. And we'll get into that example and that parallel a little bit later. But that positive review was enough to get the ball rolling. And from there, again, it is history. And so this book is really now a staple and still remains a staple of childhood development literature. So again, very much so. There's a quote by the author. We'll get into him in just a second. Norman Juster is really not so much an author for most of his life. He recently passed, I think, in the mid 2010s. And so, again, someone who was not publishing his entire life was primarily an architect. And we'll get into him in just a second. But again, this is a quote much later in his life in 2011. He says, "Today's world of texting and tweeting is quite a different place than he would have originally been writing in the 1960s. But children are still the same as they've always been. They still get bored and confused and still struggle to figure out the important questions of life." So again, the point of this is you're a child. You have that potential in you to really be anything. And whenever you're disconnected from that potential, that's where we run into problems. That's the message. So let's learn a little bit more about our author. Again, Norton Juster. Oh, actually passed in 2011, so the same year as that quote. But anyway, born 1929, died 2011. Long life. He was, again, primarily not an author. After serving in the Navy, he was working at an architecture firm where he would spend most of his career kind of periodically publishing some books for children, some for adults. The Phantom Tollbooth is far and away his most successful and most notable book, but some of his others are kind of cult classics in their own right. So if you look up too much about him, that's really what you're going to find. He is a very interesting individual and not the sort of individual you would expect to write a book as wholesome as The Phantom Tollbooth. You definitely get where the whimsy comes from, but he is someone that I would expect a much more cynical book, maybe even not for children. Whenever he was a young man, part of what you can read up on him online is that he was really fond of inventing secret societies and coming up with kind of elaborate pranks. He came up with a fake newspaper whenever he was in the Navy so that he could request interviews with women that he wanted to date for this fake newspaper. The newspaper did not exist. He also came up with a secret society that only served to send rejection letters to people that had offended him in some way. And so he would, say, "You've been rejected from such and such, alliance society or whatever," and there is no such thing. And so again, you think that this individual is going to be maybe cynical and maybe not so nice, and it's a little shocking to have a very wholesome children's book come out of this man, but here we are. So again, after he got discharged from the Navy, he actually got a Ford Foundation grant for $5,000 to write a children's book about cities. And so that's kind of the Phantom Tollbooth, and if you squint from a mile away, maybe you could see it. And so he actually wrote, again, later in his life, "I felt really bad that I took their money and then took forever to write this thing. And then, it's not at all what they had actually asked for, but obviously they got what they got. So for $5,000, maybe not so bad." So again, we'll get into what we mean by that by being kind of about cities in a second. A fun illustration. We'll get into his illustrator in just one second, but that is the Weatherman, spelled weather as in weather or if. The illustration there, the illustrator made the Weatherman look like Norton Juster because of his constant going back and forth on whether or not he would like something illustrated a different way. So kind of a fun little aside there. This is the illustrator. He is still alive. Jules Feiffer is a comic illustrator. The illustrations play a really outsized role in this book. With a lot of children's books, it is to keep the kids interested or just to break up the text and kind of pad the length. And it is just simply more fun to look at an illustrated work, especially when you're a young child. For this book, the illustrations are almost necessary. A lot of the descriptions themselves are really not going to work with, especially a child trying to picture something in their brain. without something to hold on to, because his descriptions of the various characters that we'll get into in a second are kind of off the wall, and the situations they get into are really not clear without the illustration. So we were driving. Nicole was actually reading this to me whenever we were driving, and she would stop and kind of like whenever I'm at a safe spot to drive, I'm like, yeah, look, here you go, and would show me what was going on, because even with me having already read it, you still kind of want to look. We'll get into some of the illustrations here in just a second. Again, something fun. Jules Feiffer was living with the author whenever he was illustrating this, and he was I think not paid at all in cash, maybe a little bit. Almost entirely, he'd be paid with just food. He would make dinner for two, and then he would get his half as the payment for actually making the illustrations. So very interesting working relationship there. I note here he cites Gustave Doré as one of his influences, which is a little surprising for a comic book illustrator. Gustave Doré made those famous woodcutting prints that you've seen on Dante Alighieri's work with the Divine Comedy. And so obviously that's a little bit different than what you see from most of the book. But in some of the later illustrations, whenever you get to them fighting the demons that we'll talk about in just one second, you can kind of see it. So again, the woodcutting influence there. Almost all of the illustrations are done in that pen and paper style. Some of them have a little bit more fluidity to them, but a lot of them are very kind of hash marky like that. This is also the map that comes with the book, and I think all of them have it, not just the expanded edition, but you can see sort of the area that we take place. This is a fanciful novel with, I would say, high fantasy, because it really has no bearing on the real world. Everything is sort of named with a joke, and we'll get into the humor in just one second and what that looks like. But very much things are exactly as they say they are. We start at expectations, and if you see the little arrows on the left side, that is to and from the titular Phantom toll booth, and the journey will take us from Dictionopolis to Digitopolis, and finally the Mountains of Ignorance. And we'll talk about the plot in just one second right now. So with the book itself, the plot itself is very straightforward, and it wastes no time. This is a very fast-paced book, which is good if you're trying to hold the interest of honestly an adult reader or a young reader. The plot moves very quickly, and the characters really hardly react to the plot developments. The plot can be summarized like this. There is a boy named Milo. He does not like school. He doesn't like really anything. And so one day he returns home. He doesn't want to play with any of his toys because they all bore him. And he realizes he has received in the mail a toll booth that he can set up and play with. And he decides this is at least something new, so I'll do it. He sets it up in his living room, and he drives through it in his little toy electric car. And upon driving through it, he is in the make-believe land here, the kingdom of wisdom. And so he, again, very understated reaction. He says, oh, okay, I guess I'm doing this now. And so he continues to drive until he finds the land of Dictionopolis. And from there, he says, okay, what's going on? This kingdom has been fractured. The king of Dictionopolis, and we'll read about him in just a second, is King Azaz, which is A-Z, very funny. They value words above everything else, and then they have gone to kind of almost a civil war with his brother, the math magician, who is the king of Digitopolis there at the top. And so bringing peace between those two is really the driving force of the novel. So really the entire plot is just Milo driving to the one city, driving to the other city, and then rescuing the princesses in the Mountain of Ignorance. So he's just driving around. He meets a new character almost on every page. They're always ridiculous, and they always have something to teach you, and there always is an illustration with a new character, which is very fun. So again, the plot is not what drives the novel. It is the structure, it's the delivery, it is the tone of the novel. There is a lot of humor in this that even adults will really appreciate. It's in a very straight-faced, I'd say like the Groucho Marx style, where everyone is really understated and deadpan, and like we have an illustration here in a second that kind of illustrates it. Things just happen to the characters, and every single one of them is ready to say something ridiculous or make a joke, and people don't really react in the way you would think that they would react. And again, every single character is just ridiculous. So this is not one of those things where, if you watch a children's Disney movie, there's usually one joke for adults, and the adults are like, oh, wait for it, here it comes. This is not so. With the Phantom Toll Booth, it is every page has something that even a grown adult would go, oh, okay, there it is. Maybe you're not going to be on the floor laughing, but it will definitely make you at least roll your eyes on every page. So very, very interesting there. Again, in terms of the tone, I wanted to say that this does give it maybe a wider application for age ranges. They specifically don't mention the age of Milo, the young boy, in the novel, because they don't want anyone to determine that they are just too old to be invested I think they originally said he was in between 9 and 12, and then they dropped it entirely. In terms of young people, again, they should get the humor maybe even more so than we would, but they might need explaining a little bit from time to time. In terms of the tone, what really struck me revisiting this book from when I was a child is maybe what I would say a favorable comparison to both Alice in Wonderland and Harry Potter and similarly styled things. Because if you're looking at application to your life, there really is no plot to a nonsense novel like Alice in Wonderland. The book ends with Alice simply waking up, and if you ask the character, what did you learn? The answer is nothing. It was just like a fever dream. And it's meant to entertain you, but then afterwards, what sense do you make of it? There is none. Versus Harry Potter and the bajillion imitations of Harry Potter, it's where the young person who is involved in the story needs a certain heritage or a certain something to happen to them to make their lives interesting. Whereas the thesis of the Phantom Toll book is that you already have this. If you are a young child, you are already that interesting person. You just need to give yourself a kick in the pants and go do it. And so again, you don't need to wait for your letter for Hogwarts or wait to be a Jedi or wait to do anything. You are this interesting, this important person. So again, I think that maybe that gives us a leg up already in terms of content here. We'll go through the characters really quick. There are way too many to name them all, so I picked a couple highlights, especially ones that are illustrated. My favorite, of course, is Talk the Watchdog. He's illustrated there. He's very cute. He's usually who you see on the front of the novel. Almost all of them, their names have something to do with who they are, or is just a pun in itself. Milo, again, is our main character. He's a young boy. He drives the car. They stay with this car pretty much the whole time. That is his job. He drives from again, Dictionopolis to Digitopolis and is supposed to reunite the kingdom there. Talk is his companion. He's one of the first characters that we meet. Talk is the watchdog, and his job is to make sure that no one wastes time. Whenever he gets upset, the watch alarm will go off, and so that's always a joke. And then he has to kind of wind himself with his hind legs, which is also very funny. You see him doing that there. Next, we meet the Humbug. The Humbug, Talk, and Milo are the big three. They're the characters that are in the car driving, and they are the ones who actually do most of the acting. The Humbug starts as not a very sympathetic character. He is a braggart, and he always starts to spin off stories about how he met this person and he likes that person and all sorts of things that are just really not true. And so he doesn't actually ever have any convictions or make any real conversation, but by the end of the novel, he has clearly learned something as well. Again, we already talked about King Azaz. He's the ruler of Dictionopolis, and the divide between him and his brother is what drives the novel. King Azaz says that words are the most important thing, and his brother, the math magician, says that numbers are the most important thing. And they just have such a disagreement about that they've almost come to blows, and there's almost a civil war. There's a very interesting section at the beginning where he has a banquet, and at the banquet, everyone at the city has to literally eat their words. So whenever you say something and speak it, and if you give a little speech, the words are served, have to eat them. So Milo gets into trouble because everybody else is just running through a bullet point list of whatever they want to eat. So their dinner speeches are potatoes, steak, gravy, cheese, and then it comes to them. Whereas Milo gets up and tries to say something nice, like a high school valedictorian speech, and it comes out, it's like a mess, and they don't even tell you what it looks like underneath this platter, but he just says that he doesn't eat it at all. So very funny. Continuing again, we have the math magician. He's the ruler of Digitopolis, which is the destination city. And again, he says that numbers are superior to letters. And whenever he speaks to his brother, it is only numbers that show up on the page. He doesn't even use words, which is really funny. Rhyme and Reason, we'll see a picture of them in a second. They are the two princesses who would help to mediate between the brothers. Rescuing them from their banishment becomes kind of the driving force of the novel. They show up at the end, and again, they just advise him on how to be a better, more engaged person. One of the villains is the Terrible Trivium, and we'll talk about him in a second because he does illustrate something that we want to dive into just a little bit. He is one of the many demons who live in the Hills of Ignorance, the Mountains of Ignorance, and he is a faceless man who tries to stop Milo from proceeding because he gives him an endless series of tasks to do, which are pointless to complete. So he says, you have to move this mountain of sand from here to here, but the only tool I can give you to use are tweezers. So it's going to probably take a while. Things like that. And so again, it is never a too scary of a book, but again, if you look at the drawing of this faceless man, for a young child, that might be a little bit something. The next character here, again, just a little bit of wordplay. Faintly Macabre is the witch of Dictionopolis, but it's spelled witch as either or witch. And so she is the one who used to decide which words to use, but she eventually I guess, grew power hungry and wanted to decide only on the biggest words until eventually she was just, sentences were too cumbersome. No one could say anything. And so she gets put into prison. She's the one who they meet in jail in the course of the novel. There's the humbug there. Also, he is a beetle, literally. And so he is literally a humbug. In terms of the illustrations, again, all in that same style. The top left is Milo and the spelling bee. The spelling bee is literally an enormous bee that spells words and seems really pleased with himself. There are rhyme and reason. The princess is there in the middle. The bottom left is King, or excuse me, bottom right is King Azaz, and he's looking worried because he does not, again, have that good relationship with his brother anymore. This is one of my favorite scenes in the book. If you look at the top right, you see Talk and Milo while they are driving. I think the humbug says something about it's nice weather today. There's not a cloud in the sky. That means it must rain all day. And he is immediately shot out of the car like a bullet from a gun because he's going to the island of conclusions because he has jumped to conclusions. So yeah, it's good. And so I love the fact that he just seems kind of just fully committed to whatever he's doing. And again, everyone is really just kind of understated that the whole book, and it adds to the humor in a really fun way. So again, let's start to dig into the content and let's get through. We already talked about the plot. Let's look at what it has to say about us and how we can draw something of value out of this. Again, if you read this with a child or a grandchild, having a larger discussion, it doesn't have to be something as heavy as what we're about to get into tonight, but it can be something about, why is it important that you do well in school? Things like that really do matter and pay dividends throughout your life. Being engaged and having passion is really important. Sitting on the couch and doing nothing, maybe it's okay when you're 8. If you're 18, if you're 28, much less okay. And so again, good to get this thing started early. Okay, looking here at nature and nurture. Most of us are familiar with that phrase. Which one is more important? Are they both important? I think we would agree that both play a really outsized role in how you grow up. What kind of family you have, what kind of reality you're born into. Again, someone who's born in Ukraine right now is going to have a very different childhood experience than one of us born here in the United States. There are certain things that we can change, but there definitely are things that we can in terms of nurture. Let's look at, what subjects do you really click with at school? What really are you interested in? What drives you to find other subjects and other areas of your life that you can really excel in? So excelling in anything and finding anything that you're talented at is really part of, again, the thesis of the book, but also something that really is a big deal when someone else helps you with it. If you're a young child, especially, a lot of that is not going to come from within you entirely. Again, if you pick up even the best and brightest kid and you put him in the woods and you take away, let's say we take away Mama Hummingbird here, are those babies going to grow up and learn how to fly? Maybe not. So again, what is the role of nurture? You can take that outstanding person that the child is going to be, but having that outside role and helping them really does mean a lot. Looking at this from a worldly standpoint versus a religious standpoint. I have there the verses for the parable of the talents. Again, from a religious standpoint, there is no way to say that someone has no talent. None of the individuals presented in that story are truly talentless individuals, either in terms of the money they're given or in terms of their abilities. And again, even the individual who buries his talent is that even if you just took this to the money lenders and you got interest, that would be good enough. So what does that say? I think maybe it's not reading too much into the parable to say, in this situation, there is no one who has nothing left to add to the church, to the faith, etc. No one is not good enough to engage and to thrive and to do something truly great in the faith. So I like that a lot. A quote that I actually thought about when I was reading this book here from C.S. Lewis and Mere Christianity is saying about the relationship between education and that passion and that drive and the Christian faith. He says, one of the reasons why it needs no special education to be a Christian is that Christianity is an education itself. Again, the concepts that we've already talked about, critical thinking, having passion, having drive to succeed, drive to further yourself, all of that is intrinsic to Christianity. You can't really be a Christian and avoid that. You'd go out of your way to do so. That's really, again, missing the point. So again, nature and nurture are two very important things, helping each other, helping children who are maybe more prey to some of the temptations we'll talk about in a minute. Fantastic things to learn from. And again, the point of this novel, with all of us here are adults, we either have children or grandchildren. When you're reading this, it's not so much about us at this point, maybe it's about people who are coming up behind us that we can help. In terms of education and interest, this gets back to the very basic thesis of the story. The idea that here is the quote of Milo at the beginning of the story. Wherever Milo was, he wished he were somewhere else. And when he got there, he wondered why he'd bothered. And that's how he's introduced. I think there's one sentence before that in the entire story. So he is really a kid who is spinning his tires, and there is nothing in his life that he really enjoys. So this is a little bit different than simply I don't like school. This is something that I guess for today maybe a lot of red flags is depressed. Are they not engaging? Do they not have friends, etc.? Very good to be on the lookout for this in our own lives. Am I not looking forward to doing things that I used to enjoy doing? Do I have drive? Do I have talents? I used to do this. Why don't I do that anymore? It's not, I think the phrase self-care is so overused, but let's say it's about trying to ensure that you are constantly striving to be something better. It's about trying to make sure that you are taking those steps to have a goal in mind and to apply that same critical thinking to yourself. Now, with young people, again, it's about that development. You have all these opportunities, and whenever you disengage at such a young age, it can turn you into something maybe that you don't want to be whenever you're older. If you hang on to this same attitude your whole life, where are you going to be? So let's skip to the end of the book and see what happens. I'll go ahead and spoil it for you. So at the very end of the novel, Milo, of course, saves the kingdom, reunites the kings, saves the princesses, as most of these stories do go. And so he eventually returns home. Whenever he gets back, he has been, away in this fanciful land for months. But whenever he drives back through the toll booth, he's back in his bedroom, and it's only been about an hour, as these kind of stories do have that sort of thing. So whenever he wakes up the next day to go visit all his friends again, the toll booth is gone. And now in its place, there's a letter, and it says that Milo now knows the way, and that he now has all the tools he needs, and that the toll booth has been taken to another child who needs it. So he's initially sad, but this is the quote that he closes with. He says, "I would like to make a trip," Milo said, jumping to his feet, "but I don't really know when I'll have the time. There's just so much to do right here." And so again, he was formerly someone who had no enjoyment in life, no drive to succeed. And now by the end of the novel, he, as a young boy, wants to do so many things. In the paragraph preceding that, we end up with him looking out the window and seeing all sorts of beautiful things and being grateful for all the toys his parents bought him and being excited about going to school the next day. So again, he is a very different boy at the end of the story than he was at the beginning. So again, finding a purpose is very important. And this is where you get into maybe something you want to trip up. This is not to say that kids that don't perform well in school or who have trouble finding a topic that interests them, that they don't have a purpose. First of all, really, it is about what interests you and having that drive and that mindset to try and do your best and succeed at tasks. That is all throughout the novel. It's not about simply succeeding. It's about learning and enjoying learning, whatever the end result is. And again, in terms of philosophy and religion, it's all about your attitude and your growth as a person. How can you, not succeed in the Christian faith? If you are here and putting in the work, you're succeeding. In the same way, with any kind of philosophy and personal maturity, there is no test. There's no end to it. You have to keep working. So being oriented towards the work is what is important, both here for Milo in the book and for us as we're applying this to our lives as grown individuals. Again, being oriented towards what you want to be as opposed to, again, spinning your tires. Lifestyle and engagement. Again, the villains in the story, to the extent that there are villains, some of them literally are demons who are trying to stop Milo. There's a variety of different demons you encounter throughout the story, but mostly the characters are kind of speed bumps that will try and slow him down. And usually these characters will try to waste his time. So one of the first individuals that you run into is called Officer Shrift, and he is extremely short because the short shrift is the joke there. So he is a very tiny individual, and he sentences Milo to a 1,000,000-year prison sentence for upsetting the apple cart, literally, whenever they are in the marketplace. But then he shows that he cares nothing about the law because the door to the jail is only locked one way, and so you can walk out at any time. It's just that he's the only one who gets to throw people into prison. So that's very funny. But also, again, the idea that this 1,000,000-year prison sentence is just in your mind, and you only have to stay in prison if you want to. Again, not literally, but figuratively here. The other individual, I believe you've already talked about, the Weatherman. Again, here spelled weather as in weather or. He's one of the first individuals who talks to Milo, and he initially looks like he's helping. He initially looks like he's going to give him directions, but he can't decide on anything. So he says, well, maybe you should go that way, or you should go this way, or maybe you shouldn't go anywhere at all. And that conversation goes on for about a page and a half. And so without ending up anywhere. Again, this is someone who might initially help, but is actually going to land you exactly where you started. And the last individual we already talked about, the terrible Trivium, who bogs him down with these mindless, repetitive tasks that end up accomplishing nothing. So all three of these individuals are really good examples of the characters that are trying to take up Milo's most precious resource, his time. the life that you have to spend whenever you spend it doing any of these things. The reality that exists only in your mind and it bogs you down, or the indecision to choose anything, or these mindless, meaningless tasks. All of these options have real life parallels. There are things that will stop you from being who you want to go. Here's the quote from one of the terrible trivia whenever he's speaking. He says, "But why do only unimportant things?" asked Milo, who suddenly remembered how much time he spent each day doing them. Think of all the trouble it saves, the man explained, the man being the terrible trivium demon. And his face looked as if he'd been grinning an evil grin, if he could grin at all. If you only do the easy and useless jobs, you'll never have to worry about the important ones, which are so difficult. So again, all of us have been there to a limited extent. You don't want to do your homework, you don't want to do job work, you don't want to do really anything some days. And a little bit of that I think is totally fine whenever that becomes your lifestyle, avoiding confrontation to the extreme, avoiding obligations to the extreme. Now you're becoming something entirely different and maybe, again, not who you want to be. Again, continuing with lifestyle and engagement, let's look at now applying this again to the idea of faith and the idea of becoming all who you want to be in terms of things that we would say maybe are worldly sense, things that would even be recognized as such by individuals without any sort of religious connotation. What do we think of? We think of addiction usually, drugs, pornography, alcoholism, gambling addiction. These are the sort of things that even people without any sort of religious backing would say that's a problem. You have to stop that. And again, whenever we pass laws about addiction or talk about that, we aren't looking at just speaking from a religious background. Everyone understands this is a problem. Why? Because it ends up at a point where you have no choice, where you have no time left, and you are just simply not the person who you should be and who you want to be. The decision-making process has been completely inverted, and now the decisions are moving you as opposed to you making the decisions. So again, people in the world understand this is a big problem. Obviously, for us in the faith, we understand maybe even more so that this is now removing your ability to function as God would have you, and now you are being used by something else. You are no longer entirely yourself, which is just no longer acceptable. So, in terms of young children, like again, hopefully none of those addictions that we mentioned apply to children, but what are they spending their time on? Nicole and I talk about sometimes, it's the screen kids, like kids who will always have an iPad and really enjoy that. And definitely there is a time and a place for such things. But in terms of a lot of young children, they're learning how to instantly gratify any sort of desire. They're learning how to occupy their time doing nothing meaninglessness. And again, when I was a young boy, I played quite a few video games. That sort of thing is really can be seen there. And there are certainly hours that you can waste doing a task that you enjoy. And that can be even a good thing. But in terms of something that consumes your life, where is that line and what does that look like? Again, that's maybe a different conversation, a more in-depth conversation, but there are certainly things that can balloon out of control. So I think ultimately the message that we can take from the novel and the mindset that we should all have is to be in control. Who is in the driver's seat? And if we again imagine young Milo in his car, he is the one who is driving. He's the one who's in control. And even though he asks for directions, he's the one who makes the decision. So again, be in the driver's seat of your own life. Let's look at this. We're going to break it up as a novel for children and then as a novel for adults. Again, none of us are children in the room, so we're talking about either reading this to kids or grandkids, and then again, what could kids take away from this? Is it a suitable book for kids? And then finally, for adults, is it suitable for us to sit down and read? Obviously, I think yes, we wouldn't be here, but let's break it down just a little bit. In terms of this novel, we have already gotten into quite a few heavy topics now. We have a little bit more to go. Is this too heavy of a novel for children? Absolutely not. All of this is buried underneath whimsical, fast-paced humor. It is something that will encourage your child if they're maybe struggling in that same way, but they will want to engage because of the humor, because of the illustrations, and it is something that should not confuse or upset them. In terms of, again, young children, their wonder at the natural world is something that should be encouraged. But also if they have a topic in school that they really like. So if there's a child who thinks, oh, I really like math, I don't want kids to call me a nerd. Again, this book should maybe help them to feel a bit better about that. It's not a downside, it's an upside. It means you can be who you should be and who you want to be. And again, the takeaway here, I can improve myself. I think a lot of times kids maybe only really come to that in the context of sports. If I run a lot, then I'll be able to run faster. And sometimes young children might miss that connection at school. If I do all these worksheets, wow, now math is easier. Math isn't this, abstract concept that is just hard, and it just is. That's the way it is. No, it's a skill like any other that can be honed. So I think that takeaway is fantastic. The idea that these things that I encounter at school, they are skills and they can be honed. For adults, obviously, most of us are no longer in education. If we are, fantastic. But if you decide to pursue higher education as an adult, you've probably already got that mindset nailed down. But there is definitely still something that you can take from the message here. Again, this book will not be boring for you. There is humor, there are illustrations, and for an adult, I'd say maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours to read it, and that's if you're kind of just enjoying your pace there. So again, definitely something to take a look at. As we close out, let's get into something a little bit more outside the box, and we'll step away from the novel for just a second. The idea of existentialism and the idea of self, again, heavier than maybe what we signed up for tonight, but let's take just 1 second. For us as Christians and for us as individuals who are ascribing value to anything, I think it is important that you have the building blocks of your vocabulary and the building blocks of your values really nailed down. So in terms of this novel and in terms of how you're engaging with it, I think that if you're talking with a kid or a grandkid about what I want to do with my life, is school important? I think the answer to that question is a bunch of very small questions. Is life worth living? It doesn't matter what job you end up doing. Does it matter what you really believe? Does all of this have a point? I think all of those are very, very important. And I think that this book really, in resting on, there is a sort of thing to be valued, being engaged, being productive. There is a sort of thing to not be valued, wasting your life. I think making that assumption does really require us to be a little bit versed in this. So again, this is something that would take hours to really get into, but I just wanted to mention it here in 2 different ways. So again, existentialism simply means the idea that our existence and our life needs to be defined and needs to be defended as something that has value. With the world, again, you're looking at a world that really doesn't have an answer for this. So if you are a worldly person with no backing in any sort of faith or philosophy, you're going to end up with any sort of literature that says, I want my life to have value, and you're going to end up with, but why? Why does it matter that my life has value? So that's obviously a problem. And if you see that developing in a child, I think you would need to have a couple of very, person to person talks with them as soon as possible. Those are real questions that deserve real answers. And definitely we are prepared to do that as members of the church. Now, in terms of the Christian alternative, again, there is an entire outlook that you can ascribe to this that is positive, but is not Christianity. And I say here Soren Kierkegaard. So maybe someone who we would like to read and could appreciate somewhat, but ultimately it's going to come back to scripture. It's going to come back to that critical thinking and being able to make that jump. And especially for young people to hear something in Sunday school, to hear something in a sermon, and it not be an abstract, but to be a reality. So I think that is the jump in critical thinking that you really have to make to start to get plugged in the right way. And I think that is just will pay dividends in their lives, both in terms of being able to hold that in personal philosophy and in growing in the faith. So being able to more eloquently express themselves whenever they believe something, I think very important there. Okay, so a couple conclusions that we want to make sure that we've come to, and we have a couple discussion questions in case anyone has anything. First of all, again, this book is a children's book. We've gotten into a lot of heavy topics tonight. We've covered a lot of ground, but ultimately a young child who doesn't care anything about any of that should be able to pick up the book, read it relatively quickly and relatively easily. They might not get all the jokes. They might get into some words that they don't understand just yet, but that's always good for young kids to see new words, to learn new things, and to be pushed a little bit further. So I think that this is definitely a suitable book for young children. I think it is definitely deserves to be added to the rotation if you're reading with young children. It's something that you could, maybe share a laugh with them and show them the pictures, and I think that they will be engaged. Also, I think again for adults, the thesis and just the idea that you need to lead a life that is yours and that you are engaged with is very much important. And again, we could as adults use some of this refresher ourselves. And again, finally, as Christians, I think this does sort of go hand in hand with the message that we are trying to give to young people, that there is a mature you out there, and it matters very much what kind of maturity you're going into and who you are when you become a person. So again, this verse here, Ephesians 5:15 and 16. Look carefully how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, because the days are evil. Again, the idea that every single one of us has a limited, finite amount of time that we're going to live, and it matters very much how we spend it, because even though there is an eternity following, this is the life that we are judged for. This is who we are, and this is the product of our lives. So wasting it is very much not something that we should even be thinking about, and giving young people the materials and the tools to not waste their lives as early as possible, I think is definitely something worthwhile. And again, I think the Phantom Tollbooth definitely doesn't solve that problem, but it takes a very clear step towards that for young children. So definitely would recommend that. A couple things for other reading, in case this sort of thing interests you, but maybe you've already read this book to your kids or you'd like something else. Again, Clay did Pilgrim's Progress for Inklings a while back. I would really recommend looking that up and listening to that recording if you're interested. It is a much more Christian book. It is overwhelmingly Christian, but very much the same style, the nonstop plot, relatively straightforward plot, but with individuals who encounter new characters who are really paper thin illustrations of complex topics almost on every page, very much the same as Pilgrim's Progress. Mere Christianity, if you think, well, my kid is 14, they're probably not going to engage with the Phantom Tollbooth at all. Okay, definitely, I would say if they're okay with reading a Christian book, they should look at Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Again, not that we agree with all of C.S. Lewis's theology, but he does provide a really, really accessible and easy to use summary of the Christian faith, and especially how you can easily come to Christ in a non-Christian world. So very, very good there. Another novel for young children that is also going to point towards other grown-up themes, the themes of love and loss, and a kind of an interesting place setting, the Little Prince by Antonin de Saint-Exupéry. I don't know French, but the author bases this actually on his own experience of being crashed in World War II in North Africa. So a very interesting setting. Again, not exactly to my taste all the way through, but something that is interesting. Very more so in European culture, they do read this, and this would be very much something that would be seen as a Phantom Tollbooth kind of book for them. So something that definitely you could take a look at. In terms of books, if you're interested in the idea of existentialism and how to get the vocabulary to explain that sort of thing, to be able to explain, this life has value, this life is being led by someone who doesn't value their own life, and that's a problem, these books might be a little bit more interesting for you as an adult. The Trial by Franz Kafka is almost a horror story about bureaucracy for an individual who's accused of a crime that is never clarified and is never indicated to him, and his suffering through that. Again, the thesis there is not a good one. Thesis is that this is something unexplainable to be endured, or even not to be endured, just to be suffered. And that is, again, something that we would maybe disagree with as Christians who want to be active in our lives. The writing of Albert Camus, I highlighted there The Stranger and the Plague. Both novels are about life, again, being this indecipherable foreign thing that just happens to you and you suffer through it. They're both pretty short and straightforward, but again, the very opposite of the thesis that we want to be engaging with. So again, if you want to think, well, how does the world think? How did the world think in a world without God? That might do a little bit towards explaining that. And again, not happy reads, but things that could be a little bit interesting. Finally, The Picture of Dorian Gray, maybe one that you might be more familiar with, by Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde is obviously not a Christian author in the slightest, but the message of this work is oddly religious for someone who is not so much engaged with the idea of religion. The idea is that Dorian Gray, the character, trades places with a painting almost. The painting ages, he does not, but it shows that really eternal youth and eternal, potential is wrought, and really becoming that mature person is what we should all be doing. And living is something that you should do, not as just an exercise in retaining yourself, but in living. So again, a better thesis there from a surprising source, maybe. So some of the other reading to kind of touch on the same topics. Again, not at all related to the Phantom Tollbooth, but some of the same concepts for adults or for older readers. Some of the discussion questions that we can get into if we have time, or if not, just to think about on your way home. The first one, are people hesitant to condemn certain activities or lifestyles as less worthwhile? Again, throughout the entire book, everyone is trying to get Milo to waste time, to not arrive at his destination. So for kids, it's easy to say, well, they're the bad guys. And then again, with maturity comes the question, why? Why is that bad? So how does this look different in youth than in adults? For the kids, it is wasting time, not doing schoolwork, being mean to people, so on and so forth. For adults, what is a difference in values going to look like? Again, maybe more nuance there, and something that would require a little bit more more explanation. Next, what youthful interests readily translate into worthwhile activities. So if your kid, is really into sports, that can obviously become a part of team building, a part of competitive play building. Which sort of things are not going to be worthwhile? What hobbies would you say, well, maybe this hobby in and of itself has not a lot of application in life? And that's a tough discussion to have with someone. You like doing this thing, but maybe you're wasting your time. Or is that even a conversation we should have? Why or why not? Lastly, what aspects of youth and youth culture play into different aspects of existential thought? So again, existentialism, I know we kind of dropped that word on you here at the end, but it is not something that you can opt out of. You don't get to decide to not have an opinion about life. Every single one of us is here and every single one of us has a reason to get out of bed in the morning. So ultimately, you're already in that discussion, whether you think you are or not. So for young people, it's just the same way. They need to discover, do I have a purpose? Do I have a reason to function and to continue to grow and mature? How can we find those good reasons in young people and nourish them and find maybe some of those bad lines of thought leading into apathy, leading into this disengaged self, which is maybe harmless for someone who's Milo's age. It means they just want to sleep in and not go to school and they don't like to do their homework. But as you get into someone older, it is much scarier and much more consequential. So how do we think about that? So we can return to these if we do have time. But again, that is the presentation for tonight. So thank you guys so much for your attention. Does anyone have anything they wanted to add or to circle back to? Or did we get everything?
Or like the quote at the bottom of one of your slides, that the time has been given to you, all the time you need. And it was just a nice play.
Yes, yes.
Really good taste of the language.
Yes, yeah. The language is very alliterative. It's again very, very fast paced. The sentences will almost play those tricks that you can realize you're halfway through. Very fun. All right, fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. Thanks, Roger. Have a good night.